Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 10th meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Could I remind members and others to turn off mobile phones and Blackberries, please? And we'll move straight on to agenda item 1, which is an item to agree to take agenda items 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private. Agenda item 4 is for members to discuss the evidence heard on the committee's inquiry into post-legislative scrutiny. Agenda item 5 is for members to discuss the committee's approach to its inquiry on presiding officer and deputy presiding officer elections. Agenda item 6 is for members to agree a draft report on the review of the Code of Practice for Ministerial Appointments to Public Bodies. And agenda item 7 is a consideration of the process for SPSO special reports. Do members agree to take these items in private? Agreed. Yes, agreed. Thank you very much. And that takes us on to agenda item 2, which is our inquiry into post-legislative scrutiny. And the format this morning is a round-table format, and I would hope that everyone would just participate as freely as possible. And I would like to welcome the witnesses here this morning and thank them all for their written submissions. We have Michael Clancy, the Director of Law Reform with the Law Society of Scotland. We have Professor Russell Griggs, the Chair of the Regulatory Review Group. We have Jackie McCreary, the Legal Consultant with Scottish Land and Estates. We have Professor Colin T. Reid, Professor of Environmental Law, University of Dundee, and Professor Paul Kearney, Professor of Politics and Public Policy, University of Stirling. So good morning to you all and welcome, as I say. We'll just go straight into questions, and maybe if I could just throw a general question to all of you panellists. And that is along the lines of post-legislative scrutiny is obviously something that I think everyone thinks, is a desirable thing. And a number of you, if not all of you, have mentioned the resource that would be needed in order to deal with it effectively. So I just wonder, who would like to start off by telling me what sort of resource do you think the Parliament would need to actually carry out effective post-legislative scrutiny? Who's going to volunteer to start on that one?
Often say it's hard to answer that question when we haven't decided or thought about the format that we might use, because we'd suggested in our response possibly a dedicated committee to look at post-legislative scrutiny. So that's a resource in itself in terms of manpower and expertise and skills. So it depends what way we want to go forward, how much of a resource is required.
Yeah.
I think it also depends on what it is you want to scrutinise. I mean, we've discussed this long at the Regulatory Review Group about how we and which ones we scrutinise. And you could create an industry in scrutiny, and there's no doubt about it, and it would be a kind of worthless industry because a lot of the bills and the legislation that goes through, nobody's really got any contention with. So what you're looking at are the ones perhaps where you start off with what I call the policy imperative that you're trying to produce, and then you use an instrument to try and deliver that. And there's debate at the time that you put the legislation into place about whether that's an effective instrument or not. And then you come back and look at some point in the future about whether that instrument is applied. So I think you can be quite precise if you wanted to be about the type of legislation that you want to scrutinise, because I just think to do them all would be unproductive and not a good use of parliamentary or indeed resource time.
Any other comments from?
I think in addition to that, there's the question of what you're scrutinising. Is it the overall effectiveness, which gets you into issues of compliance as well as the actual structure of the legislation? And where's delegated legislation going to fit into this? Because if where the Parent Act is just a skeleton, you can't assess the effectiveness of that without looking at the delegated legislation.
And even in addition to that, most of the acts of the Scottish Parliament now have various codes of practice that follow on from them, so that you can't scrutinise the legislation without, and sometimes it might just be the code of practice that needs to be looked at and changed without actually changing the legislation itself, so it's sort of a snowball.
Paul?
But, I mean, I think the resources you're talking about are, you know, your ability to do research and gather information, and the time you have to devote to it, which is fairly limited. And I think that's been the experience since '99. Has been the Parliament, by and large, has the ability to do post-legislative scrutiny. I mean, that's the point of inquiries to some extent. You know, you can decide as a committee to undergo a piece of work, and a big part of that is seeing what legislation is doing just now. And I think it's really just a case of the extent to which you want to make that systematic, because I think part of the problem identified is that there's some good practice in some committees, but it's not, you know, carried out throughout all committees. Now, for me, the way to deal with that resource issue in a system where the government produces most policy and amends most policy is to put that burden on the Scottish Government. It's to say that the systematic element is to ensure that whenever the Scottish Government presents policy to Parliament, that its aims are clear and that the method of assessing the success of the policy is clear from the outset, so that, you know, so the post-legislative part for the Parliament is relatively straightforward, you know, rather than having to think about, you know, first principles and what they mean when they do an inquiry.
Fiona?
Sort of question, Paul, a wee bit further on that. Sorry, Professor Kearney.
No, Paul
For the official record, I should be much more careful. You talked about systematically looking at it, and one of the things that we have discussed and looked at in written evidence from folk is what would the triggers be for, you know, a systematic look at a need for specific post-legislative scrutiny. You went on to talk about putting the burden on the Scottish Government, and I know that was in your written submission as well. And we did talk about that, I think, with the last witnesses. I have a slight worry that we're putting too much, if we go down that route, you're leaving it to a government to decide what legislation, when, and that's maybe we've taken the power away from the Parliament. So we had looked at what would be the triggers for a committee to look at legislation again, and perhaps that would give us the power rather than the government. And I just wondered if you and any of the others had thoughts for what would trigger us looking at stuff.
Professor Griggs? Sorry.
Thank you. Just perhaps to build on the point that Jackie made, you can produce wonderful legislation, and you can produce wonderful legislation, but if all the guidance and everything else that goes alongside it isn't put in place, then it just doesn't work. And therefore, I think it's not just about scrutinising legislation, it's about scrutinising everything else that goes around it. And we've seen, if we take the alcohol licensing bill, for example, it was quite clear that the guidance just didn't match the bill, and therefore people were having to make decisions, and it was the guidance that was wrong, not the legislation. So just looking at the legislation per se, I think, without looking at how it's implemented when it gets out to whoever implements it, in this case it was local authorities, I think is somewhat meaningless. Because you could go round and round in circles without actually, you could produce perfect legislation, but if you produce rotten guidance, it still wouldn't work.
Sorry, Dick, and then Michael.
To come back to the point that Professor Paul Kearney made, would you agree that possibly a committee could, as you said, they make up their own work programme, so they could decide to go back based on the fact that maybe members within the committee would suggest that, or even through the Petitions Committee, someone from outside the Parliament seeing that something is not working or believing something's not working, that they could then trigger a post-legislative scrutiny?
I think that's possible in the system just now. You know, there's that, you know, the sort of ultimate flexibility of the committees is that they can decide to do that, and it's just not a systematic process. Now, I mean, it just depends on how you want to describe it. You can say, well, it's ad hoc or it's flexible. You know, and it's you don't want to be too hard and fast. I mean, the thing about the question about the power of the Scottish Parliament, for me, the power of the Parliament is not in the detail, which it just doesn't have the resources to deal with. It's in the principles, which means that, you know, if you put the burden of government to say, well here are our aims and here's how the policy can be assessed, then that's an additional thing that can be just discussed at stage one and alongside the principles. The point about stage one is essentially the Parliament says, well, we agree with the entirety of this bill or not, and if you incorporate what its aims are and how you would measure its success there, then that to me is where the Parliament would be powerful. Not in the detailed process of how it works and how you implement it and such like.
Okay, Michael.
I think this is such a bundle of things which are all interconnected, and we started off with resources, got to triggers, and now we're talking about what the Parliament should be considering at stage one. And if one tries to separate out some of these strands from the bundle, clearly the issue of resources is something which the Parliament and government have to think about and consider and make a decision about, because we all operate within the constraints of things like the government's legislative process and statement, the issues which are brought in from outside through petitions. We operate within an environment where the outside intrudes all the time in terms of our law. There might be a decision of a court somewhere which throws up an issue relating to legislation. I can think of no better form of post-legislative scrutiny than a court saying this law happens to be off beam. So there are lots of forces which can cause the Parliament to think again, cause government to think again about its law. And so it's an issue of almost partnership between the Parliament and government to get this right. And I think if one looks at certain principles which one might think about in terms of law making, because if you put good stuff in at the start, you should get good stuff out at the end. And if there is robust legislation at the end, then the process of post-legislative scrutiny, it should be an easier task and should not present surprises. And I think we're all in the business of not being surprised, at least I try not to be surprised at things. And that, I think, then means that government does have a responsibility in all of this. And when one is thinking about the First Minister's legislative statement, one can see very clearly that if the First Minister announces 15 bills, the time for Parliament, and time is a big issue of resource, the time for the Parliament to enter into post-legislative scrutiny gets whittled down with each bill that the government decides to introduce. So perhaps a collaborative approach between Parliament and government to identify a protected zone of time where the Parliament could embark upon legislative scrutiny and a commitment from government to afford Parliament sufficient resources to be able to do that in terms of money, because time and money really are part of this issue.
How would you go about designating a protected zone of time? I mean, Jackie mentioned, a dedicated committee. That in itself would give protected time, because if the function of a committee was to do this, that would give you protected time. But if you didn't have a designated committee, how would you go about maybe doing that?
Well, I think this committee has recently been involved in discussions about Scottish Law Commission bills. And in a sense, assigning the treatment of Scottish Law Commission bills, the Scottish Law Commission is a substantial actor on the stage of post-legislative scrutiny. I think their submission to this committee indicates that that is something which they consider to be very much within their province. So this committee assigned to the Subordinate Legislation Committee the task of dealing with Scottish Law Commission bills. So there is a model for that assignation of time and resource to deal with a particular type of legislation. And one could imagine, without burdening Nigel Donn and his committee too much, that perhaps there might be tweaks to that remit or a standalone committee. I mean, I would not be too fussed which way one did it, but you know, to create committees for single purpose reasons in terms of this kind of work might be problematic. But if a committee develops a form of expertise in dealing with a form of post-legislative scrutiny, to wit Scottish Law Commission bills, then it might be able to do that with other legislation. I think, and I'll stop after this to let the debate continue, because I'm having a deadening effect in the debate, is that when you've got an issue of post-legislative scrutiny, we think about expertise in the subject area as being some kind of determining factor. And so therefore the Justice Committee should review legislation which it has dealt with, and that has been the pattern in the past. And other committees look at legislation in their remit areas. I'm not really sure that the process of legislative scrutiny needs to be related to expertise in the subject matter.
If I was to recommend one piece of resource, and one piece of resource only, that you put into this, it would be the person that reads the bill the morning after it comes out of stage 3. Because on the afternoon of the last day of stage 3, when all bills go through Parliament, having been scrutinised well by all you folks, you become politicians again. And you throw in amendments and changes to this and changes to that and changes to that, and having somebody then at the end of that, when it's all been passed through, scrutinise that what you've actually got there makes some kind of sense and will actually work. I think what will happen, we were talking beforehand, and that we've all got experience of bills that have got sentences left out, or paragraphs left out, or, you know, one clause contradicts another clause. And having a resource there at the very end of stage 3 that actually scrutinised the bill to see that in all the machinations, the political machinations that go on in the last afternoon of stage 3, that what you produced at the end of it was still a piece of legislation that could work. Now, I think if you did that, then that would overcome some of the challenges that you get later on. I'm not suggesting at all that you have the stage 4 that they have in Westminster, but just some sort of official scrutiny, maybe by the bill team that has put it through, just to make, with the Minister, to make sure it works, would be useful, because there are lots of examples out there of legislation that comes out after on the morning after stage 3, which is not quite as it was when it went in.
Right, okay. Michael, then Chucky.
Thanks. I think Russell is onto something here, but my difficulty in accepting it in its entirety, as it's been put, would be that let's say there is a shocking gap, but stage 3 is passed, the bill is passed. So we're in a position where we know there's a shocking gap, but it's on its way to the law officers for checking, and then on to the palace for royal assent. I mean, that strikes me as being the stage at which it's just that bit too late. So in earlier investigations into procedure, I think I suggested that we should think about splitting stage 3 and having an amending stage, and then, without going to a full-blown report stage, within a week afterwards, having stage 3 part 2, which gives the opportunity for that post-stage 3 amending process to get achieved, and then for people to reflect in that intervening week as to whether or not there are any difficulties with the bill as then presented, which could be dealt with at stage 3 part 2.
We are actually planning to do some work on legislation and how we process legislation. We've got it penciled in at the moment for early next year, I think. You know, so that's certainly something that we could pick up, that process, you know, I think. But I've got Jackie and then John.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on some of the points that were made. I think what both previous speakers had talked about comes back to one of the triggers that come back to Fiona's point. I think technical issues, that would certainly be one of the triggers for it. So some of the issues could be picked up at that very early stage, but some will be missed and will become evident as the legislation beds down and is implemented. We'd looked at the Law Commission in England and Wales, and they'd done some work on this area too. And in our written evidence, you'll see we'd sort of summarised some of the triggers that they'd come up with and sort of added in some of our own. So there are lots of different triggers, I think, coming back to Fiona's question, that might lead to the need for review. And again, coming back to Richard's point, I think we need to be careful as to when public interest and the public pressure from the public for scrutiny, where that tips into reform. It could be just the legislation may be working, it may be achieving the objective it's set out to achieve. It's just that there's sections of the public may not like what it's achieving. So I think we need to be careful where there's public pressure, what it's for. Is it to reform the law, or is it to go back and scrutinise how effective or how well the piece of legislation is implementing its objective? But I certainly think there isn't one or two triggers. There are going to be a number of different triggers. Some of those will be technical, some of those will be much wider in nature.
Okay, thank you. John, you want to come in?
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to sort of try and quantify this point that Professor Griggs made about mistakes that are made during the passage of a bill. And I can understand how it happens, but can you give us an indication of how many bills? I mean, I've been here in the last 6 years, and I'm not aware of many mistakes that are substantive, certainly being made. I mean, can you give us an idea of how many bills would fall into the category of having errors in them?
No is the answer to your question.
Okay.
I can give an example. The Agricultural Holdings Act, for example, of 2003, the Land Court literally had to add in its own words into section 13 because it didn't make sense as it was written. I think Professor Reid probably has other examples.
I can't remember now. I can't remember now what it is, but there's one that's got a sort of dangling half sentence that just doesn't make sense. And I got in touch with the Majesty Stationer, thinking that the version I'd seen was a mistake, and got the letter back. No, this is what we got from the Parliament, so we've just had to repeat it.
So there are a few examples, obviously, that are quite obvious, and I suppose they make us look a bit silly, when we end up with things like that. And we've got the stage 3 of the latest crofting bill going through next week as well, to correct a problem that was created by the latest crofting legislation of just a few years ago. So I think there is...
As well, Convener, if I to speak over you about the flooding, there was an issue in there where we were pointing in two directions at once.
So there is an issue here that I think we do need to look at, and I think it is something we can pick up on in terms of not so much post-legislative scrutiny, I suppose, but in terms of how we deal with the legislation under our legislative work that we're going to do. But sorry, Jackie, do you want to come back?
I think that comes back to the main gist of where we're coming from, is that you could almost avoid the need for some of the post-legislative scrutiny happening in the first place if the legislation as it was scrutinised going through Parliament maybe got a little extra time. I'm a big fan of draft bills being consulted upon before it ever gets into Parliament, because at that stage you have the legal profession have time to sit and look at it. They're the people that are going to be implementing the legislation. So a draft bill, where at all possible, to be consulted upon before it ever gets into Parliament is a good thing, because it can iron out a lot of the technical issues at that stage. And then, because once it's in Parliament, there's a very, very tight timescale for a bill to be scrutinised, and it's almost impossible for a committee who's maybe dealing with 2, maybe more bills at a time, to give it the level of scrutiny on the technical issues that it needs.
Sorry, Fiona, I think, wanted in.
I was going to ask exactly the same question as John Lamont, but I will ask it again. Is there any way that we can get figures on how many bills we've got problems like that with? Because we're all coming up with ones off the top of our head, which makes it sound like it's lots, but we've actually done hundreds of bills since 1999, so if it is only 3 or 4. So I think it would be interesting if anybody could tell us, not now, but...
If I can comment, it's not just mistakes. I remember when we had finished doing our post-legislative scrutiny on the alcohol licensing bill, having a good discussion with an MSP, and his comment to me was, "I've read your report, Russell, and it's absolutely correct, and it was my fault." I said, "How do you mean it was your fault?" He said, "I put in an amendment without realising what the impact was." So it's not just about making mistakes. It's about putting in clauses that you put in, and MSP puts in quite legitimately, without us understanding what the impact would be.
To get better MSPs is a conclusion of that.
So,
until a number of years down the line, we've got, and these may be mistakes that may seem small, typographical errors, but there's a resource, because we've had land court cases, that have lasted years over, a clause where there's been a bit missing, or interpretation has been difficult, or it's been ambiguous. So there's a resource issue there to, and it could be a number of years down the line before issues arise.
Paul, then Margaret, and then John.
I mean, just to complicate things further, I mean, if I was, putting resource in somewhere, I would say we'll do it a bit later, because, I mean, one of the key parts of the Stage 3 process is that ministers will often say to MSPs, that very thing, that amendment won't work, but if you trust us, we'll go off and we'll make regulations to fulfil your points. And I don't get a sense that many people are then going to check, what the minister has done to address those points, and to check the extent to which it changes the aims of the bill. So for me, if there's a Stage 1 process where they're setting out clear aims and how those aims might be met and how you assess them, it makes sense to check after the legislative process if it's made a significant difference to the bill. Has it made a change to the aims of the bill, and how you would assess it in future?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Margaret. Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking of the EU procurement bill. We've got problems just now in that local authorities just now are interpreting the procurement bill differently from each other, which is resulting in maybe like smaller businesses actually being able to sort of tender for work. And that, I keep hearing, is each local authority's interpretation of the procurement bill. Is there any possibility, and we've got our procurement bill going through Parliament soon in the Infrastructure Committee, and I'm sort of thinking, is there any way you could test that, say the procurement bill, when it's in its early stages, to see if it's the local authorities that are involved with it, to see what their understanding and interpretation of it would be first before it got to the next stage, to make sure there is clarity and understanding?
We've made two recommendations, and one for alcohol licensing and one for knife crimes, which to say, if you're producing a bill that in the end has to be delivered by somebody, please go and speak to the person who's got to deliver it at the consultation stage, at the pre-legislation period, so that when you get there, it's actually deliverable, and that the words are coming out and the guidance are absolutely clear. And we don't do that currently. In a lot of cases, the licensing clerks or the planning officers or the procurement officials won't always get involved in the consultation process that officials within Scottish Government do. Now, my own view is that if you're producing somebody you want, in the end, somebody else to deliver, then you get them involved at the beginning. So I think there's a lot more we could do about getting people involved at the beginning, which would stop that happening. And it may be that you don't have to change the legislation. It's about making the guidance more precise. And I think in a lot of cases we put in, for all sorts of good political reasons and for good common sense reasons, fairly loose pieces of legislation where you need a strong piece of guidance to interpret some of it. And again, that's where you need it. So my own view to that, to resolve that, you put in more expertise, practitioner expertise at the beginning in the consultation phase.
Thank you.
The courts can,
hang on, Jackie. I've got John and then Michael. Then I'll take yourself.
My comments now about out of context was just really in response to what Professor Russell was saying about the problems that politicians sometimes create by amending bills without actually understanding the consequences, or indeed understanding how the court will interpret them at a later date. And I mean, it just struck me that, surely that's not new. I mean, for as long as we've had parliaments, we've always had politicians, and there's always going to be a danger that we are going to create problems or have mistakes. And until you remove politicians from the equation, you're going to have that going forward. And it's very hard to see how we're going to have any sort of foolproof system to properly.
Michael. Well, that put me in mind of and here you are, this is showing my age. In 1424, the previous Scots Parliament decided that it would set up a commission to examine and mend the laws that need amendment. So this is not a new problem at all. I think, to a certain extent, that the issue which you raised, Margaret, was something which Jackie had touched on, which is draft legislation being exposed in good time for people to be encouraged to look at it, think about it, and consider how they would deal with it. And that takes me back to that kind of collaborative approach which I was mentioning earlier, that if one considers who it is that is going to deal with this legislation, and that will depend on the kind of legislation it is. Procurement issues, very clearly, local authorities, government agencies, big business, these would be the people who would be involved in procurement issues. So a pretty easily identifiable group of people. But another piece of legislation, let's say protection from abuse, might be a more disparate group of people. But if you can identify who's going to use the legislation and engage with them, which picks up Russell's point, at an early enough stage, then you might get into a position where you can predict what people think about a piece of legislation. How they would interpret it after it's made, I think that's a much more difficult proposition, because then remembering that whatever one local authority with a particular administration may think about a piece of legislation, it will not be binding on a future local authority with a different administration, in much the same way as a parliament doesn't bind, or a government doesn't bind future governments. So people's interpretation of legislation could change. It could change over time. It could change in relation to external stimuli, such as a decision of a court, and that makes the business of fixing an interpretation and making sure that everybody sticks to that one interpretation a very difficult proposition.
Jackie.
I think a point to make on that, and I think you've made it, is to get the people who are going to be affected by the legislation involved in drafting the guidance, even, you know, have consultation on that, so that as far as possible you can have a consistent approach if that's what's required, so that, because guidance in itself could be ambiguous, so involve the people who are affected. I mean, as in our organisation we do that, and it works well if you get involved with government in looking at the legislation, whether we're writing it for our members or whether the government's writing it and our members are going to have to comply with it, to work together and you produce something that everyone understands.
Paul, yeah.
Well, just a brief point. I like to separate the sort of the technical from the principle here. On the one hand, it's important for there to be as much consultation on bills before they come into Parliament for good technical purposes to get the legislation right. On the other hand, this was a key criticism of Westminster when the Scottish Parliament was set up, that what the government used to argue was we can't change this bill to any extent because we've already gone through a meticulous process of consultation and drafting, which means if you do anything here in Parliament, it's going to undermine the bill. And part of the CSG process was to say, well, we encourage more draft bills, which means that they are more susceptible to amendment through the parliamentary process, because that's the only way you can demonstrate that the parliamentary the scrutiny process is important. You know, if all that happens is an almost finished bill comes into Parliament and it goes through a conveyor belt almost the same way, then it really there's very little point of the committee process as set up. So there's a real trade-off there between the technical, practical, and the principle of Parliament, in its entirety.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, Helen, thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, having heard what we've heard, do you favour any particular approaches to piloting a new approach to the scrutiny process?
Michael?
Last week I was at a conference at which the Leader of the House of Commons, Andrew Lansley, was speaking, and he was talking about a project which the Office of the Parliamentary Draftsman in Whitehall was was proposing, which was the Good Law project. And, you know, everyone signs up to good law. And in their report, when laws become too complex, which is part of the issue which we're dealing with here, they talk about changes to parliamentary procedure in Westminster. And there was a pilot on a couple of bills known as a public bill reading, where the bill would be put in the parliamentary process on the website and comments invited from the public. Now, I think the one which I think we got involved with was the small charitable donations bill. It wasn't a particularly effective mechanism for us at the time because for a start, even though you were told on the website that it was there, you couldn't find it. You know, so there has to be a way in which you can get the bill into the public eye, make it easy and accessible for people to look at, and easy and accessible for people to give their views on. Taking Paul's point, I mean, the CSG was looking at the way in which the Parliament's procedures should operate to maximise the accountability, the transparency, and the founding principles of the Parliament. And it's important that we remember the balance between government action and parliamentary scrutiny when we've got a unicameral Parliament, because it needs to be the case in those circumstances that the committees of the Parliament are strong enough to be able to hold government to account. And that's part of this process of post-legislative scrutiny, is holding government to account for their ideas. And getting that balance right is going to be a difficult issue. I think to a great extent the Parliament has succeeded in getting that balance pretty nearly right, but there are occasions when that might become more problematic than in other instances. But
a suggestion that we'd made was possibly, whether it's a pilot, I'm not sure, would be to pick 1 or 2 areas of law per session or per year, and do a complete review on. An example we gave was nature conservation law is massively complicated now. We've got a pre-devolution acts which have been amended north and south of the border in different ways with subsequent legislation, secondary legislation, guidance, codes of practice. It's ripe for a total overview, possibly some consolidation. And again, there's a resource issue there, but it may be an idea to pick 1 or 2 areas of law and do a complete review, not just of the primary acts, but of everything that goes with it, and to get that right, rather than to pick 7 or 8 pieces of legislation and just do a sort of a summary review. To actually an in-depth review of 1 or 2 areas might be an idea.
Can I just maybe... Sorry, on you go, Colin.
Specific example, though, it's an example where the lack of political will, because I've given evidence on the various nature conservation bills that have gone through, and consistently we have said, the committees have said, the law's a mess, it needs consolidation. The government has said, yes, we'll think about, yes, we appreciate that, we'll do something about it, and 10 years on, nothing, no progress.
Yeah. So on the point that Jackie and Colin have made, would it be up to then organisations or Law Society or different other, SNH, different other organisations to suggest to Parliament that they scrutinise or go back over a bill, but it's Fiona, I think, said earlier on, there's been hundreds of bills passed through, but there are many bills that are way back, not even as far back as 1424. There are many bills that I would suggest that, way back from the start of the century, 1900s. When people quote to me, "Oh, it's under the 1937 Act," or whatever, that I think should be upgraded, amended, or looked at, and possibly agreed on how many. We couldn't do hundreds, as Jackie suggests, but we could maybe do 3 or 4 during a particular year.
That's part of the remit of the Scottish Law Commission, is to keep up-to-date consolidation, tidy up the statute book and so on, but they struggle to have the resources to do it, partly because you do need government, even they need government support from within departments or directorates of the government to help with that. And if you look at court decisions, parliamentary committee reports, inquiry reports, pressure groups and so on. There are endless examples of people identifying areas of legislation that need to be improved, tidied up. But if it's not a politically exciting topic that spurs the government on, things can sit around for ages. I mean, certainly in English criminal law, subject I've been doing some teaching in, there's a criminal law act in England 2 or 3 every year, yet there are some well-known technical problems that the House of Lords Supreme Court have identified, saying this area needs to be tidied up, and 20 years on, it's still not been done because it's not the exciting area.
That, I think, neatly takes me into, we've ranged over quite a lot of different things here, and I'd like to maybe try and focus in for a short while on the issue of you know, the dedicated committee, or designating the new Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, which is its proper title now, Michael, as opposed to sub-ledge, and whether, you know, that would be a good way of ensuring that at least some sort of focused post-legislative reform was carried out, because we do have the power, as Paul said earlier, you know, committees do have the power to do it at the moment. There has been some work going on, some quite good work, but not an awful lot. And the problem, it seems to me, is, as was mentioned earlier as well, that the government always has a pretty full legislative programme, and it's how you actually build in the time with a limited Parliament in terms of number of MSPs and number of committees, how you actually create some space in there to allow us to do at least some post-legislative scrutiny. So I wonder if we could focus just for a short while in on the dedicated committee idea, or designating the likes of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. Could we just focus in on that to see if we can get some kind of common view in on that? Russell, then Paul.
I think we start, first I would have to agree with John and say I would never want politicians to stop being politicians, because that's what we elect you for. So we'd never do. I think the challenge, though, we have then, if you do then post-legislative scrutiny, is to accept that we will always find mistakes. And therefore the challenge is about not then politicising the mistakes, if I can put it that way, which I know is sometimes also a challenge to politicians. That if we're genuinely going to use post-legislative scrutiny to make the legislative better, taking the point that Colin was making, you know, to look for the genuine mistakes, therefore we probably need to set some rules around it, and that's why it perhaps has to be a committee that does it, who has a very precise role in this, so it doesn't end up about arguing about policy. I mean, in our role on regulation, the one thing we don't do is when we're reviewing a piece of legislation is argue with the policy. If that's what the policy was, that's what the policy there. All we are there to do is to test whether the bill is delivering that policy. Whether we agree or disagree with the policy is immaterial. And I think, therefore, if you're doing that type of scrutiny, and that's what you want the committee to do, then there has to be some quite clear rules about you not disappearing back into the political debate about what the policy is in the first place.
I mean, on the committees, I mean, I'll give you a very balanced academic view, which means I'll contradict myself. The first one, again, if you go back to the CSG, the whole point of these kinds of committees was that they combined standing function and a select function, so that you developed subject-specific experts, and they became business-like, and they could really do something. I mean, there's a practical side to that, in that there's such a turnover, it's not always clear if that actually has worked. But there's also a practical side, I think, to a dedicated committee, in that it's likely to, well, maybe not likely, but it could well be a graveyard committee. You know, it could, I mean, I don't know, you use that word, don't you? That it's the one where you get sent to if you're unpopular or you're being punished. Now, if that's the outcome, then it's but you know, if that's the case, then you know, to some extent, a dedicated committee would need the status and the prestige so that people would actually listen, and you know, that could be the problem. I mean, to contradict myself, I guess what I'm suggesting there is don't change the committees too much. But the opposite argument is that there are so many. You know, one of the things is dedicated committee for cross-cutting issues like environmental policy, sustainable environment. The problem is that virtually every issue is cross-committee, you know, inequalities or health inequalities or something like that, you're going to face that problem to the extent that you either stick with the subject committees to deal with that, or you completely rearrange them to deal with the fact that the Scottish Government has rearranged its functions to be cross-cutting rather than departmental. I mean, I think that's just not something that we could recommend. That would just be something that would be up to you. For me, the second question about how you find the time, I think the only way that would work is if you get a commitment to find the time when the legislation is going through. So, I mean, I suppose that's going back to my original point. I think if the part of the government's process is to say, well, in 1 year or 3 years or 5 years, you know, we will produce a report for discussion about how well this has gone, then that gives you the opportunity for some routine. I mean, I think examples would be good. I mean, for me, the simplest example is, say, the ban on smoking in public places. Now, that's one where you could say, well, our initial aim is to have 100% or as close as compliance with this policy. Our longer-term aim is to reduce smoking in the population. And those are two things that you could have a discussion about. One is the fairly technical one, you know, has it achieved its short-term aims? Another one's giving you a chance to say, well, do these policies actually work in the way they're intended?
Just in relation to the idea of reporting, it is something that's coming into legislation nowadays. There is, in the Climate Change Act, there's lots of examples of things the government has to report on at certain stages. The Wildlife and Natural Environment Act added in the duty to report on the compliance with the biodiversity duty every 3 years. The government's got to report. And I think in time that's something that the Parliament will develop experience on, seeing, is this working? Again, in the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, there's the requirement to report if legislation, delegated legislation, isn't introduced on training for people who are going to be shooting deer. There's a power to introduce regulations on this. If no regulations have been introduced by a certain time, they've got to report on that, because it may well be that voluntary and other mechanisms are working well enough. And that sort of technique the Parliament is already adopting, but there hasn't really been enough time for practice to build up to see how effective it is.
Michael?
Yeah, I think building into the legislation where it's appropriate, some mechanism for there to be post-legislative scrutiny is clearly a way where the time would have to be allocated then. You know, because if one is bound by the law, and we're talking here about whatever the legislation would say, so it could be the case that the minister would have to provide a report within a certain period of time, or that there might be some form of sunset clause which would bring the legislation to a close pending a report. And I cited an example of that where I had been involved, and it was a Westminster bill pre-devolution in the Crime and Punishment Scotland Act of 1997, where there was a requirement to undertake a research project within a year of the legislation coming into effect, and then for that report to be given to Parliament within 3 years, otherwise the section would lapse. And I think that clearly is a way where one can signal as a Parliament that this kind of activity needs to be done. And given that it would be put into the bill, you could choose when that would be appropriate. For some bills, this is not necessarily a problem. But for others, post-legislative scrutiny is an extremely desirable process to go through.
Tailored, depending on the bill. It would also, am I right in thinking, this would normally be something you'd be asking government to do?
Normally.
Yeah. And would that be appropriate in the case of all bills, or maybe at differing levels for differing bills? Because if government's going to have to review every single bill, I could see a situation arising after a few years that the legislative programme is going to be reviews of bills and nothing else.
Well, as I was saying, it would be tailored for each bill, so therefore you wouldn't have to have it in every bill. It would be because some issue of considerable controversy had come up during the passage of the bill, or from witnesses in stage 1 proceedings. it signified that this was something where Parliament would like to find out how this was operating in practice after 3 years of operation. I mean, already we're in the process where we're looking at legislation which had been brought in the early years of the Parliament. So your anxiety, convener, about reviewing legislation is a reality. But that's the nature of law, and until we get to my desired solution, which is codification, we're not going to be able to resolve that.
Would the panel think that a combination of things might be the best way forward? Building into bills a review period where appropriate, maybe designating a particular committee to have a particular remit to set aside some of its time to choose certain bills as well, and also leaving the power with committees, all committees, the power that they have at the moment to do legislative, reviews anyway. So you could have any committee looking at any legislation that it had been involved in, if it chose to do so. You'd have the specialist committee, if you like, which would have a particular remit to look at, and set aside some time each year to do one or two, post-legislative scrutiny bits of work. And then you would have the things built into legislation where government would be coming forward anyway, because it was built into the legislation. A combination of those three things might work to give us a far greater level of scrutiny than we've maybe been getting up until now. Jackie?
I would totally agree with what you've just described. I think we need to have a bit of flexibility, so I think having more than one avenue to approach it is definitely right. What attracted us to having a dedicated committee to perform some function was, well, A, to raise the status and the profile of post-legislative scrutiny in the Parliament. I mean, I can see the risk that Paul has highlighted of it becoming the graveyard committee, but I think it would be the opposite, would be to raise the status of the issue so that as bills are going through the committee stages, the MSPs, everyone knows that that's not the end of it. There's someone else looking at it after you've finished with it. And there's a risk possibly of subject committees, once they've done and dusted a bill, they may not have the inclination, even if they have the time, to go back and look at the same issue. So having another dedicated committee to look at it, I think there's an attraction in that. But I do agree that we need the reporting mechanism could feed into that committee as well. That committee could ask for reports. It could delegate things back to subject committees. It could ask for independent research. It could ask for the opinions of experts. So I think having an overseeing dedicated committee with other avenues available is a good suggestion.
I would just add a fourth to what you said, convener, which is all the bills that you put through have to be enacted by somebody, whether it's a regulator or a local authority or the police or somebody. Perhaps what you do is you ask them as well to have as part of their remit of an NDPB or the body itself to, in specific cases, review the legislation and see how it's operating and report back to Parliament. So it becomes a statutory duty for them to report back to Parliament on how pieces of legislation. So you're not doing all the work yourself. I think one of the challenges is if you only have the resource in one place, then you'll only end up doing what the resource can cope with. Whereas if you've got all these bodies out there whose job it is on a day-to-day basis to do that, then they should hopefully have a role in reporting back, and you can make it specific about what they have to do.
Thank you. Paul?
I think on the topic of a separate committee, I think this is one where you could learn from your colleagues in equivalent committees. So I mean, I guess it's not subordinate legislation. It's the,
delegated powers and law reform. Right. There we are.
Because that's a similar argument that you say. Well, not only can subject committees consider delegated legislation, but there's also a dedicated committee. Now, it'd be worth finding out from people on that committee if that is what happens. I mean, my gut instinct is that because people know there is a dedicated committee, they leave that work to them and they only deal with the issues that are referred to them. If there were issues where the subject committee actually said, well, we're worried about this delegated legislation, before the committee brought it to their attention, then that might give you more of a sense that it would work. Yeah,
I'm just checking with the clerk there. the Delegated Powers Committee, Legislation Committee, all delegated stuff goes to them, but also goes to the subject committees. So it's kind of dealt with by both. So it doesn't just go to that one. So, Michael, I think you wanted in.
I have just a slight worry about the idea of subject committees undertaking post-legislative scrutiny if there is a dedicated committee or an enhanced remit for the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. That would take away from the time of the subject committee to conduct inquiries. It could mean that one might have the subject committee looking at some aspect of post-legislative scrutiny on a bill, perhaps on a very specific area of that bill, and the dedicated committee looking at the same bill. So, you know, one would have to make sure that there was a good level of coordination, and of course, depending upon politics, because of course all of this is within the framework of politics. One might not get as much cooperation between committees as one would ideally hope for. So I would maybe just be a little cautious about the subject committees undertaking that level of post-legislative scrutiny if there is a dedicated committee.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that's... Sorry, Colin. Yeah.
The problem I see with that attempt to draw that division, though, is you can't really draw the division between post-legislative scrutiny and an inquiry into an area where there's one or two acts that are particularly important, because it just depends what label you do. You're going to be doing the same work. So the idea that post-legislative scrutiny is something that is completely freestanding and separate from the rest of the work, I think I have problems with.
If I can just imagine a circumstance where the inquiry comes up against an issue which relates to post-legislative scrutiny, then that's the time to bring in the dedicated committee and say, here you are, our inquiry has thrown up an issue about this statutory provision, remit to you.
I think just one final point I wanted to make was that if we had a dedicated committee, that we shouldn't forget that they should look at good practice too, because it shouldn't all be about looking at what's going wrong, but maybe look at areas where things have worked well, or a particular method of implementing a law or a particular technique has worked well, and share good practice. I think that would be important as well.
Right, well, thank you. Does anybody get any other points that we want to make before we kind of wind up? Paul, yeah?
Yeah, just, I mean, the final point I was thinking about is it's easier said than done when you say that, you know, that you should oblige governments to state very clearly what their aims are and how they can be assessed. I mean, I think a good way to demonstrate that would be to do it yourself, would be to say, you know, what is our aim when we're making these recommendations on post-legislative scrutiny, and how can we measure the success or failure of them? And I think that sort of thought process shows you how, you know, complicated it is, and that puts you in the mind of the extent to which governments can do it in each circumstance.
Right, well, thank you very much, all of you. That was very useful, very helpful, giving us plenty of food for thought, along with the previous session that we had, and you'll all get a copy of the report, which will keep you riveted for days on end. So we'll adjourn just for a few moments whilst the panel and the tables are rearranged. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Get started again. Yeah, thank you. The next item is for the committee to consider responses received from cross-party group conveners. Members will remember that at the meeting on 23rd of May we agreed to write to the following cross-party groups as they were identified as not having met for over a year. They were the Beer and the Brewing Industry Group, the Cooperatives Group, the Park Homes Group and the Sexual Health Group. The responses received from the conveners are annexed in paper 3, which you should have before you. And I just wonder, first of all, if members have any general comments, or would you just like to go straight in to deal with each of the individual cases? Helen.
I think it's proven to be a worthwhile exercise, convener, and I think that's very helpful. Particularly pleased to note that there's one of the groups has offered to lapse its membership, and that just demonstrates that sometimes things move on and issues change, and that the COP and the other one of the other groups has indeed met and established a programme of activities, so that's very good to see that. And as note, there's a question mark over one of the other groups, but yeah, good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I think that's very encouraging, and we should maybe just note the fact that the Cooperatives Group and the Park Homes Group are both now have had their AGMs and they're back on track, and the Sexual Health Group is lapsing. In terms of the Beer and the Brewing Industry Group, the convener was basically asked for a wee bit of guidance as to whether the group should lapse or sit in abeyance. I don't think there's any kind of process that allows for groups to sit in abeyance, so my suggestion would be that we suggest to the group that they should lapse, and if there was a need in the future for them to be reformed, they could come back and make a case to re-establish. Would Dick?
I certainly agree with you, convener. I don't think there is a case that anyone can just sit aside in abeyance. I think they should lapse, and then we'll have to, under the new procedures, come back and present a case to be re-established.
Are we all agreed on that?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for that. That ends the public part of the meeting, and we'll now move into private session.